July 1944, Normandy, France. Allied tanks are trapped, unable to advance past ancient hedgerows that have become death traps. Thousands of soldiers are dying in fields they can't cross. Engineers have tried explosives, bulldozers, and complex mechanical solutions. All have failed. Then a 29-year-old sergeant from New Jersey walks up to his captain with a sketch on the back of an envelope. 4 metal tusks welded to the front of a tank made from scrap German beach obstacles. Everyone thinks he's crazy. 2 weeks later, General Omar Bradley watches in awe as a Sherman tank fitted with this insane device explodes through a hedgerow like it's made of paper. This simple invention will help win World War II. This is the true story of Curtis G. Culin and the Rhino tank. June 6, 1944, D-Day. Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy in the largest amphibious invasion in history. By sunset, over 156,000 American, British, and Canadian soldiers had established a foothold in Nazi-occupied France. The world watched as the invasion succeeded beyond expectations. Casualties, while significant, were far lower than planners had feared. Within days, Allied forces controlled the beachhead and began pushing inland. Victory seemed inevitable, just a matter of time and determination. But by late June 1944, the invasion was stalling. Allied forces had advanced only a few miles inland from the beaches, far short of their objectives. The problem wasn't German resistance, though. That was fierce. The problem wasn't lack of supplies or equipment, though logistics were challenging. The problem was the land itself, the Norman Bocage, a landscape of ancient hedgerows that transformed rural France into an impenetrable fortress. The Bocage consisted of fields separated by earthen walls built over centuries. Norman farmers had cleared rocks from their fields and piled them along property lines, creating barriers to contain livestock. Over hundreds of years, these rock walls accumulated dirt, grass, bushes, and trees. By 1944, the hedgerows stood between 6 and 15 feet high, 3 to 12 feet thick, composed of packed earth, rocks, and dense vegetation, with roots extending deep into the ground. Each field was a separate compartment, isolated from neighbors by these ancient walls. For infantry, the bocage was challenging but manageable. Soldiers could climb over hedgerows or find openings. But for tanks, the armored vehicles essential to modern warfare, the bocage was a death trap. Sherman tanks attempting to climb over hedgerows would tilt up steeply, exposing their thin underside armor. German soldiers quickly learned to position anti-tank weapons, covering these vulnerable moments. When a Sherman's nose pointed skyward, climbing a hedgerow, a German Panzerfaust rocket or anti-tank gun could punch through the weak belly armor, destroying the tank and killing the crew. The few openings that existed in the hedgerow networks became kill zones. German defenders positioned machine guns, mortars, and anti-tank weapons covering every gap. Allied tanks attempting to pass through these openings faced concentrated fire. The openings were often too narrow for multiple tanks, preventing coordinated attacks. German defenders could hold a single opening with a handful of soldiers, stopping entire Allied formations. Allied commanders tried various solutions. Combat engineers used explosives to blast holes through hedgerows, but the explosions took time to prepare and attracted immediate German attention. Specialized bulldozers could push through hedgerows, but bulldozers were slow, unarmed, and highly visible. German gunners quickly learned to target bulldozers, denying Allies the means to breach obstacles. Tanks fitted with bulldozer blades fared slightly better, but still moved slowly and attracted concentrated fire. By early July 1944, the situation was desperate. Operation Cobra, the planned American breakout from Normandy, was scheduled for late July. This offensive would determine whether the Normandy invasion succeeded or bogged down into costly stalemate. But Operation Cobra required tanks to advance rapidly across the Bocage. exploiting breakthroughs before Germans could reposition defenses. Without a solution to the hedgerow problem, Operation Cobra would fail, the invasion would stall, and the war would continue indefinitely. Throughout American units in Normandy, soldiers and officers brainstormed solutions. Units tried dozens of different approaches: modified plows, reinforced bumpers, cutting blades, explosives on poles. The 79th Infantry Division developed a hedgecutter operational by July 5th. 19th Corps demonstrated steel prongs. The Corps invented devices nicknamed brush cutters and green dozers. Every unit was searching for the answer, the innovation that would restore battlefield mobility and save the invasion. That answer would come from an unlikely source: a New Jersey National Guard sergeant serving with the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, a man who saw possibility in German scrap metal and understood that sometimes the simplest solutions are the best. Curtis Grubb Culin III was born on February 10, 1915, in Cranford, New Jersey. He came from a family with deep American roots, descended from Colonel Curtis Grubb, a patriot of the American Revolution. The Culin family had a tradition of service, and Curtis grew up understanding duty and responsibility. Friends and family called him Bud, a nickname that stuck throughout his life. Before the war, Culin lived an ordinary American life. He worked, enjoyed time with friends, and participated in his community. In 1940, as tensions escalated in Europe and the Pacific, Culin joined the New Jersey National Guard, enlisting with the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, known as the Essex Troop. This unit traced its lineage back to pre-Revolutionary War cavalry organizations, carrying traditions of mounted warfare into the modern mechanized age. By 1940, the 102nd Cavalry had transitioned from horses to armored vehicles. Instead of riding horses, troopers drove light tanks and armored cars, conducting reconnaissance and screening operations. Culin trained as a tanker, learning to operate and maintain M4 Sherman medium tanks and M5 Stuart light tanks. He understood these vehicles intimately, their capabilities, limitations, and vulnerabilities. This mechanical knowledge would prove crucial. When the national emergency was declared after Pearl Harbor in December 1941, Culin's National Guard unit was federalized and integrated into the 2nd Armored Division, one of the U.S. Army's premier armored formations. The 2nd Armored Division, nicknamed Hell on Wheels, was commanded by Major General Ernest Harmon and would play a crucial role in European operations. Culin trained with the division through 1942 and 1943, participating in exercises that prepared soldiers for the complexities of armored warfare. By June 1944, Sergeant Culin had been in the Army for 4 years. He had risen to the rank of sergeant through competence and reliability. His commanders respected his mechanical aptitude and practical problem-solving ability. Culin wasn't an engineer with formal education in design and mechanics. He was a soldier who understood how things worked, who could improvise solutions with available materials, and who wasn't afraid to try unconventional approaches. On D-Day, June 6, 1944, Culin landed in Normandy as part of the invasion force. The 2nd Armored Division came ashore in the following days, moving inland to support the expanding beachhead. Culin experienced the Bocage problem firsthand, watching tanks struggle to navigate the hedgerow-divided landscape. He saw tanks expose themselves climbing over earthen walls. He witnessed the deadly effectiveness of German defensive positions covering hedgerow gaps. He understood viscerally that without a solution, American armored forces would be neutralized, unable to exploit their mobility advantage. Throughout late June and early July, as various units attempted different solutions to the hedgerow problem, Culin observed and thought. He was a mechanic by training and temperament, someone who solved problems through practical experimentation rather than theoretical analysis. He examined the hedgerows, studying their composition and structure. He looked at the German beach obstacles scattered across Normandy, the steel beam structures that had been intended to impede the invasion, but were now just scrap metal. He thought about what tanks needed, not to go over hedgerows, but to go through them at ground level, without exposing vulnerable underside armor. The idea crystallized during a conversation with fellow soldiers about the Bocage problem. According to military historian Max Hastings, a soldier from Tennessee nicknamed Roberts suggested, "Why don't we get some saw teeth and put them on the front of the tank and cut through these hedges?" The other soldiers laughed at the simplistic suggestion. Culin didn't laugh. He recognized the idea's potential, seeing how it could be implemented practically with available materials. What Culin envisioned was deceptively simple. 4 metal prongs welded to the front of a tank, angled forward and down like tusks on a charging animal. These prongs would dig into the base of a hedgerow where earth met vegetation. As the tank drove forward, the prongs would cut through the earthen foundation, breaking the hedgerow's structural integrity. The tank could then push through at ground level, maintaining traction, keeping its guns pointed forward, and never exposing vulnerable underside armor. The genius was in the simplicity and the materials. All across Normandy, German beach obstacles lay scattered and broken. Before D-Day, German forces had positioned thousands of steel obstacles along the beaches to impede the invasion. These obstacles came in various designs, but the most common were check hedgehogs, 6 steel beams welded together in an X-shaped pattern designed to rip the hulls of landing craft. The hedgehogs were made of strong structural steel, each beam approximately 8 feet long and 4 inches square. After the invasion, these obstacles were useless to the Germans, but valuable as raw material. Culin realized he could cut check hedgehog beams into shorter sections, creating 4 sturdy prongs. These could be welded to a steel framework that would bolt or weld to the front of a Sherman tank. The prongs needed to be strong enough to withstand the forces of cutting through packed earth and vegetation, but not so heavy that they compromised the tank's performance. The angle of the prongs was critical. Too steep, and they would push the hedgerow up instead of cutting through. Too shallow, and they wouldn't penetrate the earth effectively. Culin sketched his design, working out the details on paper. He calculated approximate dimensions, drew the mounting framework, and figured out how the device would attach to a Sherman tank's hull. The design was crude by engineering standards, but functionally sound. It required basic metalworking skills, cutting steel beams with torches, welding them together, and bolting or welding the assembly to the tank. No complex machinery or specialized tools were needed. Any unit with a welder and cutting torches could fabricate the device, but Culin faced a challenge common to all innovators in military organizations: the chain of command. He was a sergeant, the lowest rank of non-commissioned officer. To implement his idea, he needed approval from officers, who would need approval from their commanders, who would need approval from division headquarters. Military bureaucracy moved slowly, carefully, with proper procedures and formal reviews. Time was critical, with Operation Cobra approaching. But military organizations weren't designed for rapid innovation. Culin took his sketches to his immediate commander. Showing the design and explaining the concept, the captain was intrigued but skeptical. Could something this simple really solve a problem that had stumped engineers and commanders for weeks? The captain forwarded the idea up the chain of command. Major, lieutenant colonel, colonel, each level reviewed Culin's design with growing interest. The idea was unconventional, unauthorized, and completely outside normal procurement procedures. It was also potentially brilliant. By mid-July 1944, Culin's design had reached Major General Ernest Harmon, commanding the 2nd Armored Division, and Lieutenant General Omar Bradley, commanding 1st Army. Bradley was preparing Operation Cobra and desperately needed solutions to the Bocage problem. When Bradley heard about Culin's Hedgecutter, he ordered an immediate demonstration. If the device worked as Culin claimed, Bradley wanted it mass-produced and fitted to every tank possible before Operation Cobra launched. A Sherman tank was procured, check hedgehog beams were gathered, and welders got to work fabricating Culin's device. The prototype took less than a day to construct, demonstrating the design's simplicity and practicality. On July 14, 1944, the modified Sherman was ready for testing before General Bradley himself. The demonstration would determine whether Culin's insane idea would be dismissed as impractical or recognized as the solution that would help win the July 14, 1944, a Norman field south of St. Lo. General Omar Bradley stood with his staff officers, watching as a Sherman tank fitted with Culin's prototype device idled nearby. The tank looked unusual, almost comical, with 4 steel prongs jutting forward from its hull, like the tusks of some mechanical beast. Bradley, normally reserved and analytical, was willing to try anything that might solve the hedgerow problem, but he had seen numerous failed solutions over the past weeks. He remained skeptical but hopeful. The test hedgerow was typical of the Norman Bocage, approximately 8 feet high, 10 feet thick at the base, consisting of packed earth, rocks, and centuries of accumulated vegetation. Trees and bushes grew from the top, their roots binding the structure together. Previous attempts to breach similar hedgerows had required explosives, bulldozers, or tanks climbing over at severe angles. All these methods were slow, dangerous, or both. At Bradley's signal, the Sherman's engine roared to full power. The driver released the brakes and accelerated toward the hedgerow, the modified tank gathering speed across the 50 yards of open field. The crew kept the guns pointed forward, maintaining combat readiness even during the test. As the tank approached the hedgerow, Bradley and his staff braced for impact, unsure what would happen when steel met earth at high speed. The collision was spectacular. Culin's steel prongs struck the base of the hedgerow with tremendous force. The prongs dug into the packed earth, cutting through roots and rock. The tank's forward momentum drove the prongs deeper, breaking the hedgerow's foundation. Earth vegetation and debris exploded upward and outward as the tank's weight and power overwhelmed the ancient barrier. For a moment, the Sherman disappeared into a cloud of dirt and broken branches. Then the tank burst through the other side, emerging into the adjacent field with barely any loss of speed. The entire transit took perhaps 3 seconds. Where a solid hedgerow had stood, there was now a tank-sized gap, rough but passable. Infantry could follow through the breach, expanding the opening for additional vehicles. The demonstration exceeded all expectations. Bradley reportedly watched in awe, immediately recognizing the implications. This simple device solved multiple problems simultaneously. Tanks could breach hedgerows at speed, maintaining momentum crucial for offensive operations. They no longer exposed vulnerable underside armor, climbing over obstacles. The prongs were made from available materials, requiring no supply chains or specialized manufacturing. Most importantly, the device could be fabricated quickly by unit maintenance sections using basic tools. Bradley turned to Culin, who had been watching nervously, and asked how many of these devices could be produced and how quickly. Culin explained that any unit with welders and cutting torches could make them. The materials were lying all over Normandy in the form of German beach obstacles. Production was limited only by available welders and time. Bradley made an immediate decision: produce as many Hedgecutters as possible before Operation Cobra launched. Every Sherman tank that could be fitted with the device should be modified. This was now highest priority. Orders went out throughout First Army. Maintenance companies began gathering Czech hedgehogs and cutting them into prong sections. Welders worked around the clock, fabricating mounting frameworks. Tank crews brought their Shermans in for modification, watching as their vehicles transformed into hedge-breaching assault weapons. The modifications spread virally through American units as word of the device's effectiveness reached other divisions. Culin's design was nicknamed the Culin Rhino device, or Culin hedgerow cutter. Soldiers quickly shortened it to Rhino, and tanks fitted with the device became Rhino tanks. The nickname was apt, like African rhinoceroses charging through brush. These modified Shermans could bull through obstacles that had stopped conventional tanks cold. The race was on to modify as many tanks as possible before Operation Cobra launched on July 25, 1944. Ordnance companies throughout First Army mobilized every available welder, a cutting torch, and metal fabrication resource. German-Czech hedgehog beach obstacles became valuable raw materials, with soldiers scouring beaches and German defensive positions to gather the steel beams. Piles of cut prong sections accumulated near welding shops as production ramped up. The modifications followed a rough standardization based on Culin's original design, but variations emerged as different units adapted the concept to available materials and specific tank models. The most common configuration used 4 prongs, each approximately 3 to 4 feet long, cut from Czech hedgehog beams. These prongs were welded to a steel framework that bolted or welded to the front of the tank's hull, positioned low and angled slightly downward. The total weight of the assembly was approximately 500 to 750 pounds, depending on design variations, enough to add structural strength without significantly compromising tank performance. Some units created more elaborate versions with additional bracing, reinforced mounting points, or different prong configurations. Others simplified the design further, using whatever steel was available rather than specifically seeking Czech hedgehog beams. The British Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers, WWII, produced their own version called Prongs, initially fabricating 24 devices from German beach defenses, then shifting production to the United Kingdom for standardized manufacturing. By late July 1944, production statistics were impressive. American units had fabricated approximately 500 Culin Hedgecutter devices. The 2nd Armored Division, Culin's own unit, modified nearly 3/4 of its Sherman and Stuart tanks and M10 tank destroyers. Across First Army, an estimated 60% of Sherman tanks received the modification before Operation Cobra launched. The British produced 600 Mark I prongs by August, with additional production of Mark II and Mark III versions for different tank models including Sherman, M10, and Cromwell tanks. The modifications weren't perfect. Some welds cracked under stress, requiring reinforcement. Prongs occasionally bent or broke when striking particularly dense hedgerows or hidden rocks. The added weight slightly reduced acceleration and increased fuel consumption. The forward-mounted steel framework obstructed the driver's vision somewhat, though this was minor compared to the tactical advantages gained. Tank crews accepted these minor drawbacks willingly, understanding that the ability to breach hedgerows at will was worth far more than marginal performance penalties. The psychological impact on troops was enormous. Soldiers who had felt trapped and vulnerable in the Bocage now had a tool that restored mobility. Tank crews gained confidence, knowing they could charge through hedgerows instead of exposing themselves climbing over. Infantry knew they could advance behind Rhino tanks, using the breaches to infiltrate German defensive positions. The mood shifted from frustration and stalemate to anticipation and offensive spirit. German intelligence noticed the tank modifications, but initially didn't understand their significance. Reports described American tanks with unusual forward-mounted steel devices, but German analysts assumed these were improvised armor or mine-clearing equipment. The true purpose would become devastatingly apparent once Operation Cobra began. Production continued even after Operation Cobra launched, with additional tanks being modified throughout August and September 1944 as the campaign expanded. The British shipped prefabricated prongs from the United Kingdom, allowing tanks to be modified before deploying to France. By autumn 1944, the Rhino tank had become standard configuration for Allied armored forces operating in hedgerow terrain, a testament to how quickly a good idea could spread when operational necessity demanded it. Culin's simple innovation, sketched on the back of an envelope and demonstrated in a Norman field, had been mass-produced and distributed across multiple armies within 2 weeks. This rapid adoption demonstrated the power of practical field innovation when proper command support existed. July 25, 1944. Operation Cobra began with massive aerial bombardment of German positions south of St. Lo. Over 2,400 Allied aircraft dropped bombs and napalm on a rectangular target area, approximately 7,000 yards wide and 2,500 yards deep. The bombardment was intended to obliterate German defenses, creating a gap through which American armored forces could pour. Breaking out from the Normandy Bocage into open country beyond, the aerial assault was devastating but not perfect. Some bombs fell short, killing and wounding American soldiers in forward positions. The bombardment raised massive dust clouds that obscured the battlefield. German defenders, though badly shaken, survived in sufficient numbers to mount resistance. The breakthrough would not come easily. American forces would have to fight for every yard, advancing through the shattered landscape while German forces tried desperately to contain the penetration. The Rhino tanks went in with the lead assault waves. Sherman tanks fitted with Culin hedgecutters charged forward, bursting through hedgerows that would have stopped them weeks earlier. Instead of slowly grinding through obstacles or exposing themselves climbing over earthen walls, the Rhinos crashed through at combat speed, maintaining momentum crucial for exploitation. Infantry followed close behind, using the tank-created breaches to advance without exposing themselves in the killing zones of hedgerow gaps. The tactical impact was immediate and dramatic. German defensive positions designed around the assumption that tanks couldn't easily breach hedgerows found themselves bypassed or outflanked. American units could now maneuver in the Bocage, creating the kind of fluid, combined arms operations that conventional terrain permitted. German commanders, already reeling from the aerial bombardment, discovered that their defensive advantages had evaporated. The Bocage that had protected them now became a trap as American tanks burst through hedgerows from unexpected directions. Lieutenant Colonel Walter Duncan, commanding a battalion in the 2nd Armored Division, reported that the Rhino tanks worked beautifully during Operation Cobra. His tanks advanced rapidly through multiple hedgerow lines, breaching obstacles that would have required hours to overcome using previous methods. The speed of advance prevented German forces from establishing coherent defensive lines, keeping them off balance and unable to concentrate forces effectively. Combat reports from Operation Cobra consistently praised the Rhino tank's performance. Unit after action reports described how the devices restored battlefield mobility, allowed tactical flexibility, and boosted morale. Tank crews reported that the ability to breach hedgerows on their own initiative, without waiting for engineers or bulldozers, made them feel empowered rather than constrained by terrain. Infantry praised the Rhinos for creating safe passages through hedgerow lines, reducing casualties from German machine gun fire covering traditional gaps. The German response was initially confused. Defensive plans had assumed the Bocage would significantly slow American advances, buying time for reinforcements and counterattacks. When American armored spearheads maintained rapid movement despite the hedgerows, German commanders struggled to adjust. Reports from German units described American tanks that could somehow drive through the hedges, undermining defensive calculations. Some German commanders suspected American forces had received new, more powerful tanks, not realizing the breakthrough came from a simple modification. By July 27, 1944, just 2 days after Operation Cobra began, American forces had punched through German defensive lines and were exploiting into more open terrain. The breakthrough expanded rapidly as German resistance collapsed in the face of American armored thrusts. While many factors contributed to Operation Cobra's success, including overwhelming air support and German strategic errors, the Rhino tank's contribution was undeniable. They had restored the mobility and shock action that made armored forces effective, turning potential stalemate into breakthrough. General Bradley would later write that the Culin Hedgecutter undoubtedly saved lives and contributed significantly to Operation Cobra's success. The simple device had helped end the Normandy stalemate, enabling the Allied breakout that would eventually liberate France and lead to Germany's defeat. The success of the Rhino tanks in Operation Cobra ensured their continued use as Allied forces advanced across France. While the Bocage was specific to Normandy, other obstacles required breaching throughout the campaign. Rhino-equipped tanks proved useful for clearing rubble in destroyed towns, pushing through makeshift barricades, and opening paths through defensive obstacles. The psychological benefit persisted, even when not specifically needed for hedgerows. Tank crews liked having the capability available. As the Allies broke out from Normandy and swept across France, in August 1944, the pace of operations accelerated dramatically. German forces retreated, attempting to establish defensive lines, but repeatedly being outflanked and overrun. American armored divisions led the pursuit, with the 2nd Armored Division advancing nearly 200 miles in less than 2 weeks. The rapid movement vindicated the emphasis on mobility that had driven the search for hedgerow solutions in the first place. British and Canadian forces in Normandy also adopted prong-equipped tanks for their operations. While British Commonwealth forces advanced through somewhat different terrain than the Americans, facing the Bocage in their sectors as well, the prongs proved equally effective. British after-action reports praised the devices, though some historians have debated their overall tactical significance. The debate centers on whether the devices were truly essential to the breakout or merely helpful, among many contributing factors. The historical assessment of the Rhino tank's impact has evolved over decades. Immediately after the war, popular accounts credited Culin's invention with decisive importance, describing it as the key that unlocked the Normandy stalemate. Some accounts exaggerated, claiming the invasion would have failed without the Hedgecutter. Later historians, analyzing the campaign more critically, noted that multiple factors contributed to the breakthrough. Aerial bombardment, artillery support, German strategic mistakes, and superior Allied logistics all played crucial roles. Military historian Stephen Zaloga, writing about Operation Cobra, argues that the Rhino tank's tactical significance was real, but their strategic importance was overstated in popular histories. Zaloga notes that only about 60% of American tanks were modified before Operation Cobra, meaning substantial numbers of unmodified tanks also participated successfully. He suggests the devices were helpful but not indispensable, part of a package of tactical improvements rather than a single decisive factor. However, even skeptical historians acknowledge the device's practical value and their psychological impact on troops. Whether or not the Rhinos were strategically decisive, they unquestionably gave soldiers confidence and tactical flexibility. They represented the kind of field innovation that characterized American forces throughout the war: practical, improvised, and effective. The willingness of commanders like Bradley to adopt unconventional solutions proposed by low-ranking soldiers demonstrated organizational flexibility that many historians credit as an American strength. The Rhino tanks continued in use through autumn 1944 as Allied forces advanced into Germany. Some units removed the devices once they left hedgerow country, finding the added weight and vision obstruction unnecessary in other terrain. Other units kept the modifications, valuing the capability to breach obstacles even if not regularly needed. A few Rhino tanks survived the war and were preserved in museums, physical artifacts of battlefield innovation. Production of hedgecutters ended by October 1944 as the Normandy campaign concluded and forces moved into different terrain. The British had produced approximately 2,100 prongs of various marks by war's end, while American production had yielded around 500 Culin hedgecutters. These numbers represented a small fraction of total Allied tank strength, but demonstrated rapid production capability when operational requirements demanded it. The Rhino tank had served its purpose, restoring battlefield mobility during a critical period when the invasion's success hung in balance. Whether decisively important or merely helpful remained debatable, but undeniably significant to the soldiers who used them. For his innovation, Sergeant Curtis G. Culin was awarded the Legion of Merit, a decoration given for exceptionally meritorious conduct in the performance of outstanding services. The citation recognized Culin's hedgecutter invention and its contribution to the Allied success in Normandy. It was a significant honor for an enlisted soldier, acknowledging that breakthrough innovations could come from any rank, not just officers or formally trained engineers, but Culin, described by historian Max Hastings as an honest man, tried to deflect credit to Roberts, the soldier from Tennessee whose offhand remark about sore teeth had inspired the design. According to Hastings, Roberts' contribution was forgotten in the publicity surrounding Culin's invention, despite Culin's attempts to ensure proper credit. This illustrated a common pattern in military innovation. Ideas often emerge from collaborative discussion, but credit goes to the person who implements the concept. Practically, the publicity surrounding Culin's invention made him what Hastings called a very American kind of national hero. News reports celebrated the sergeant from New Jersey who had solved a problem that had stumped engineers and generals. The story fit a particular American narrative, the common man using practical ingenuity to overcome challenges, the democratic nature of good ideas that could come from anyone regardless of rank or formal education. Culin became a symbol of American resourcefulness and the citizen-soldier tradition. General Bradley featured Culin's invention prominently in his post-war memoir, A Soldier's Story, published in 1951. Bradley wrote, "So absurdly simple that it had baffled an army for more than 5 weeks. The tusk-like device had been fashioned by Curtis G. Culin, a 29-year-old sergeant." Bradley's account emphasized the invention's simplicity and the fact that it came from an enlisted soldier, using it to illustrate principles of military innovation and the importance of listening to ideas from all ranks. President Dwight D. Eisenhower, who had served as Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe during the invasion, also referenced Culin's invention in post-war speeches and interviews. In a 1964 television interview with CBS correspondent Walter Cronkite, filmed on the 20th anniversary of D-Day in actual Normandy hedgerow country, Eisenhower told the story of the hedgecutter invention. Eisenhower emphasized the morale boost the invention provided troops. The biggest and happiest group, I suppose, in all the Allied armies that night were those that knew that this thing worked. And it worked beautifully. Eisenhower repeated this story in various forums over the years, using it to illustrate points about innovation, morale, and the contributions of ordinary soldiers. In a 1964 address to the American Society of Mechanical Engineers, Eisenhower described Culin's invention as an example of engineering principles applied practically under combat conditions. These high-level endorsements from Bradley and Eisenhower ensured Culin's story became part of the official narrative of the Normandy campaign. Culin received his Purple Heart for wounds received in combat, though details of the circumstances are not well documented in available records. He survived the war and returned to the United States in 1945. That same year, he married Bernice Enright, beginning a post-war life far removed from the battlefields of Europe. The couple settled in New York City, where Culin found work with Shendley Industries, a spirits company. He lived a quiet civilian life, working in business and occasionally participating in veterans' events. As a member of the Sons of the American Revolution, Culin maintained connection to his family's tradition of service and patriotism. He rarely sought publicity for his wartime invention, apparently content to have served and returned home. For nearly 2 decades after the war, Culin lived as an ordinary civilian, known to neighbors and colleagues as a veteran, but not particularly celebrated. Curtis G. Culin died on November 20th, 1963. In Greenwich Village, Manhattan, at the age of 48. The cause of death is not prominently documented in available records. His death came just 2 days before President John F. Kennedy's assassination, an event that dominated news coverage and public attention. Culin's passing was noted in newspapers, particularly in his hometown of Cranford, New Jersey, but received little national attention. For many who remembered his wartime fame, his relatively early death was a sad end to the story of American ingenuity and heroism. Culin's hometown of Cranford has maintained his memory more actively than broader national recognition. Local historical societies and veterans organizations have preserved documentation of his contribution. Preserve Cranford, a local historical organization, includes Culin's story in their educational materials about the town's World War II veterans. Periodically, local newspapers publish articles about Culin, particularly around D-Day anniversaries, reminding residents of their town's connection to a significant military innovation. The broader historical legacy of Culin's invention remains somewhat contested among military historians. The popular narrative, promoted by Bradley and Eisenhower and repeated in countless documentary films and popular histories, credits the Rhino tank with decisive importance in breaking the Normandy stalemate. This narrative is compelling, dramatic, and fits satisfying patterns of American ingenuity overcoming challenges. However, academic military historians have offered more nuanced assessments. They note that Operation Cobra's success resulted from multiple converging factors: overwhelming aerial bombardment, superior Allied logistics, German strategic errors, and various tactical innovations beyond just the hedgecutters. Some historians argue the popular accounts exaggerate the Rhino tank's importance, suggesting they were helpful but not indispensable to the eventual breakout. Stephen Zaloga, a respected military historian specializing in armored warfare, has written critically about what he terms the Culin hedgecutter myth. Zaloga doesn't dispute that the devices were useful or that Culin deserved recognition for his innovation. Rather, he argues against claims that the devices were singularly responsible for breaking the Normandy stalemate, noting that unmodified tanks also participated successfully in Operation Cobra, and that multiple other innovations and factors contributed to the breakout. Zaloga's work represents a broader historiographical trend toward more critical analysis of popular World War II narratives. Despite these academic debates, the practical impact of Culin's invention remains undeniable. The devices worked as intended, restoring mobility to tanks operating in Bocage terrain. They boosted troop morale by providing a tangible solution to a frustrating tactical problem. They demonstrated the value of field innovation and the importance of organizational structures that allow good ideas from lower ranks to reach decision-makers quickly. These contributions merit recognition regardless of debates about their decisive importance. The story also illustrates important principles of military innovation. Culin succeeded not because he had formal engineering education or official authorization to develop solutions, but because he understood the problem intimately from field experience, recognized a practical approach when he heard it, and persisted through military bureaucracy to get his idea tested. The rapid adoption of his design, once it proved effective, demonstrated that military organizations, despite their reputation for bureaucratic inertia, could move quickly when motivated by operational necessity. Modern military innovation programs sometimes reference Culin's story as an example of effective bottom-up innovation. The U.S. Army's rapid equipping programs and field innovation initiatives explicitly cite the Rhino tank precedent, encouraging soldiers to propose solutions to tactical problems and establishing streamlined processes for testing and adopting promising ideas. The principle that good ideas can come from anyone, regardless of rank, has become official doctrine. Though implementation remains challenging in practice, the physical artifacts of Culin's innovation survive in museums. Several Sherman tanks fitted with Rhino devices are preserved and displayed at military museums in the United States and Europe. The National World War II Museum in New Orleans displays a Rhino-equipped Sherman, using it to tell the story of Normandy innovation. The U.S. Army Ordnance Museum at Fort Gregg Adams, Virginia, preserves examples of the device. These physical artifacts allow new generations to see the simplicity and practicality of Culin's design, understanding how something so straightforward could have such significant impact. In Normandy itself, several memorials and museums include references to the Rhino tanks and their role in the campaign. The Normandy American Cemetery and Memorial Visitor Center includes exhibits about innovations that contributed to the invasion's success. Local French museums in the Normandy region display hedgecutter devices, explaining to visitors how Allied forces overcame the tactical challenges of the Bocage terrain. For French civilians living in former battle areas, the Rhino tanks are remembered as symbols of liberation, the technology that allowed Allied forces to break through and free their communities from occupation. Curtis G. Cullin's story teaches lessons that extend beyond military history into broader questions about innovation, organizational culture, and problem-solving under pressure. At its core, the Rhino tank story is about recognizing that expertise comes in many forms and that practical field experience can generate insights that theoretical analysis misses. Culin wasn't an engineer with advanced degrees in mechanical design. He was a mechanic, a soldier who understood tanks through hands-on experience. He saw the hedgerow problem not as an abstract challenge requiring complex solutions, but as a practical obstacle requiring straightforward tools. This perspective allowed him to recognize the potential in a simple idea that formerly trained engineers might have dismissed as too crude or unsophisticated. The story also highlights the importance of organizational culture in fostering innovation. Culin's idea reached General Bradley within days because the chain of command was willing to listen to proposals from enlisted soldiers. Captain, Major, Colonel, General, each level could have dismissed the idea as inappropriate coming from a sergeant, but each chose to evaluate it on merit rather than source. This organizational openness to ideas regardless of origin was crucial to the rapid adoption of the innovation. General Bradley's decision to immediately order mass production after a single successful demonstration showed leadership. Willing to take calculated risks, Bradley could have ordered extensive testing, formal engineering reviews, and careful evaluation of alternative approaches. Such caution would have been entirely reasonable and consistent with normal military procurement procedures. But Bradley recognized that time was critical, that Operation Cobra couldn't wait for perfect solutions, and that a good enough answer implemented immediately was better than a perfect answer that arrived too late. The rapid production of approximately 500 American and 2,100 British hedgecutters demonstrated industrial flexibility and the power of using locally available materials. Because the devices required only basic welding and metalworking, and because materials were literally scattered across the battlefield in the form of German obstacles, production could scale quickly without straining supply chains. This improvised manufacturing approach would have been impossible, with more complex designs requiring specialized components or precision manufacturing. The story illustrates a principle often overlooked in discussions of military technology. Sometimes low-tech solutions are more effective than high-tech alternatives, precisely because they're simpler, more reliable, and easier to produce and maintain. The Rhino tank wasn't elegant engineering. It was rough, crude, and aesthetically unimpressive. But it worked, could be built quickly by field units with basic tools, and required no specialized knowledge to operate. These practical advantages outweighed any theoretical benefits of more sophisticated approaches. There's also a cautionary element about how we remember and mythologize historical events. The popular narrative of Culin's invention, while generally accurate in broad strokes, has been simplified and dramatized over decades of retelling. The device became the thing that won Normandy in popular memory, when the reality was more complex and multifaceted. This mythologization doesn't diminish Culin's actual contribution, but it reminds us to approach triumphalist narratives critically, recognizing that military success results from many factors working together rather than single decisive innovations. For Culin himself, the experience demonstrated how military service can thrust ordinary individuals into extraordinary circumstances, where their contributions have impact far beyond what peacetime life would have offered. He was a New Jersey guardsman who became a national hero through a combination of practical insight, good timing, and an organizational culture that allowed his idea to flourish. After the war, he returned to ordinary life, working in business and living quietly. The dramatic wartime chapter was just one part of a full life that also included family, work, and community. The fact that Culin tried to share credit with Roberts, the soldier whose offhand remark inspired the design, speaks to his character and to the collaborative nature of innovation. Good ideas rarely spring fully formed from a single mind. They emerge from conversations, build on others' suggestions, and develop through iterative refinement. Culin's willingness to acknowledge Roberts' contribution, even as publicity focused on the sergeant from New Jersey, showed humility and honesty that made him worthy of the recognition he received. Curtis G. Culin's Rhino tank represented the best of American military innovation. Practical, improvised, effective, and rapidly adopted. Whether it was the decisive factor in breaking the Normandy stalemate or one helpful contribution among many remains debatable. What's undeniable is that it worked, that it helped, and that it demonstrated principles of innovation and organizational flexibility that remain relevant decades later. The sergeant from Cranford, New Jersey, who saw possibility in scrap metal and sketched a solution on the back of an envelope, proved that sometimes the most valuable expertise comes not from credentials or formal training, but from practical experience, creative thinking, and the courage to propose unconventional solutions. In July 1944, that combination of qualities helped break a tactical stalemate and contributed to liberating Europe from Nazi occupation.